March 28, 1979. Dawn breaks over the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. The twin cooling towers of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant loom over the misty water. On this morning in our timeline, a minor malfunction snowballed into America's worst nuclear power accident, a partial reactor meltdown that shook public confidence and reshaped energy policy. But imagine a world where this disaster never happened. How might history have changed if 3 Mile Island's Unit 2 reactor had a normal day instead of a near catastrophe? Would nuclear energy have flourished, and what ripple effects would touch our economy, politics, society, and technology? In reality, the 3 Mile Island accident was a frightening close call. Although no one was killed or injured, and the radiation release was minimal, the incident gripped the nation with fear. News reports of a partial meltdown and an ominous hydrogen bubble kept Americans on edge. President Jimmy Carter, himself trained in nuclear engineering, flew in to calm the public. The 1979 disaster became a turning point, prompting sweeping safety reforms and stricter regulations in the nuclear industry. More significantly, it fueled public distrust of nuclear energy, contributing to a near halt in new reactor projects. Over 50 U.S. nuclear reactor orders were cancelled between 1980 and 1984, a mix of regulatory burdens, rising costs, and shifting public opinion. Before the accident, nuclear energy had been heralded as the future of American power. After it, it became a source of anxiety. Now let's step into an alternate timeline, one where the 3 Mile Island crisis is averted. Perhaps in this scenario, an alert operator notices a warning light early on, or a relief valve doesn't stick open, as it did in reality. The morning of March 28, 1979 passes quietly at the plant. To locals in nearby Middletown, it's just another Wednesday. No mass evacuation of frightened families, no national headlines about a nuclear nightmare. The film The China Syndrome, coincidentally released just days before, remains a fictional thriller, not an eerie predictor of real events. The industry breathes a sigh of relief, and public trust remains intact. Without a highly publicized meltdown, the nuclear industry avoids billions in losses. In real history, 3 Mile Island's damaged reactor cost about $1 billion and took 12 years to clean up. Many reactor construction projects were delayed or cancelled, partly due to new safety requirements and public opposition. In this alternate timeline, those costs and delays don't materialize. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission issues no emergency shutdowns of similar reactors, unlike in our timeline, when 7 reactors of the same design were temporarily closed. Public support for nuclear power remains strong. Polls before 3 Mile Island showed supporters outnumbered opponents by 2 to 1. Without a frightening news cycle, that support doesn't erode. However, while nuclear expansion continues in this timeline, it wouldn't be an unchecked golden age. Some of the cancellations of the 1980s were due to economic realities, not just fear. Construction costs for nuclear plants had been rising since the early 1970s, and the growth of coal and natural gas as energy sources meant nuclear had competition. Even without 3 Mile Island, some reactors still wouldn't have been built. One of the biggest effects of 3 Mile Island was its role in galvanizing the anti-nuclear movement. Protesters in our timeline, including a massive rally of 200,000 people in New York City that September, where speakers like Jane Fonda and Ralph Nader railed against nuclear dangers. Without the disaster, this movement might have remained on the fringes. But this also raises a sobering question. Would nuclear safety have improved as much without a major wake-up call? In our reality, 3 Mile Island led to stricter training, improved reactor designs, and greater oversight. Without it, complacency could take hold. Minor accidents might still occur, but without the scrutiny that TMI brought, they might be brushed aside. The real test of this alternate timeline might come later, perhaps in the 1990s or 2000s, when an accident occurs that forces the industry to confront problems it had been ignoring. Imagine a near meltdown at a US plant in 1995, after years of unchecked expansion. Would the public backlash be even worse? Economically, the immediate aftermath sees the nuclear industry avoid billions in losses. In real history, 3 Mile Island's damaged reactor cost about $1 billion and 12 years to clean up. Many reactor construction projects were delayed or cancelled, partly due to new safety requirements and public opposition. In our alternate timeline, those costs and delays don't materialize. Companies like Babcock and Wilcox, which designed the TMI-2 reactor, preserved their reputation instead of seeing orders scrapped. Investors and utility executives, not shaken by a high-profile scare, continue to fund new nuclear plants. Fewer reactor orders are cancelled in the early 1980s. In reality, over 50 US nuclear reactor projects were cancelled between 1980 and 1984, on top of dozens more already shelved in the 1970s. Without 3 Mile Island, many of those projects might proceed. Construction crews keep pouring concrete and setting reactor vessels in place across the country. By the mid-1980s, the US could have dozens of additional reactors nearing completion, vastly increasing the nation's nuclear power capacity. We can envision the political climate of the 1980s in this alternate world. The late 1970s had seen energy crises and high oil prices. Leaders were searching for reliable domestic energy. Nuclear power, providing electricity without importing fuel, was a promising solution. After a non-event at 3 Mile Island, President Carter, and later President Reagan, maintained strong support for nuclear energy without public backlash. Regulatory agencies like the NRC proceed with a business-as-usual approach, perhaps incrementally improving safety standards, but not overhauling their rulebook overnight. In our timeline, 3 Mile Island forced regulators to broaden oversight and require extensive safety upgrades, from emergency training drills to having NRC inspectors on site at all plants. In the alternate timeline, such reforms come more slowly or in piecemeal fashion. Politicians tout nuclear power as part of American progress. We might hear Reagan in 1984 praising the continued expansion of safe, clean nuclear energy in this world, language that would have been politically difficult in our reality after 1979. Of course, not everything is rosy. By averting a crisis, the industry may have also missed a critical lesson. In our timeline, the 3 Mile Island accident exposed hidden flaws in reactor design, operator training, and emergency preparedness, and the fixes implemented afterward greatly improved safety. Without that wake-up call, some issues could fester. In the alternate 1980s, there might be smaller incidents or close calls at nuclear plants that did not get the scrutiny they would have received post-TMI. Perhaps an operator error or minor equipment failure at another reactor causes a scare. Not a full meltdown, but enough to prompt internal reviews. The difference is, these happen more out of the public eye, since no iconic disaster alerted the media and general public to watch closely. Insiders in the industry might quietly note, "We were lucky there," and only gradually implement improvements. Paradoxically, the lack of an early disaster could set the stage for a later one if complacency grows. It's conceivable that without the hardened safety culture instilled after 3 Mile Island, a serious accident might occur at a US plant in the late 1980s or 1990s in this alternate timeline, finally forcing the reforms that 1979 would have prompted. History might just delay the reckoning, a sobering possibility. Meanwhile, in the global context, the absence of 3 Mile Island's scare in 1979 means the first big jolt to world nuclear confidence would be the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. When Chernobyl's reactor exploded in the Soviet Union, an event entirely independent of TMI, it horrified the world. In our timeline, Americans had already been sensitized by 3 Mile Island to fear nuclear accidents. Chernobyl further cemented that fear. But in the alternate timeline, Chernobyl arrives as a shocking outlier. Western nuclear advocates are quick to draw distinctions. Our reactor designs are safer, our protocols are better, they insist, and with 3 Mile Island's spotless history, many believe them. While some segments of the American public do grow wary after 1986, the ongoing momentum of nuclear construction in the US tempers the reaction. Projects underway aren't cancelled en masse. Instead, American regulators and engineers quietly incorporate a few extra safety measures in light of Chernobyl, then continue with their expansion plans. Countries in Europe and Asia too might pause only briefly. After all, if the United States, the world's nuclear leader, has never had a major accident, that builds confidence in the technology worldwide. The global growth of nuclear power in the 1980s might slow less than it did in our reality. Historically, the number of reactors under construction worldwide had been rising until 1979, then plummeted after TMI, and again after Chernobyl. In the alternate scenario, the 1979 inflection point vanishes, potentially keeping the growth curve up until 1986. By the 1990s and 2000s, the long-term consequences of a no-TMI world become clear. The United States likely enjoys a larger fleet of nuclear power stations than in our timeline. Instead of roughly 100 operating reactors, the number we ended up with, there could be well over 150. Many of the nuclear plant orders that were aborted in our history would have been completed. Indeed, more than 100 reactor orders were cancelled in the 1970s and 1980s, amid shifting economics and public opinion. This means that by the turn of the century, nuclear energy provides a much greater share of US electricity. In our reality, nuclear power peaked at about 20% of the electricity mix. In the alternate 2000, it could be, say, 30% or more. Such a shift has far-reaching implications. The reliance on coal-fired power plants would be lower, reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Environmentalists in this timeline find themselves in a complex spot. They may have opposed nuclear in principle, but its broad adoption is keeping millions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The fight against climate change might be slightly ahead, thanks to a more decarbonized electric grid. Oil and gas interests would also feel the impact with nuclear supplying more electricity, natural gas power plants become less competitive, and the energy market balance tilts. Socially, communities across the country would have grown up with nuclear plants as a more common feature. Towns that in our timeline saw planned reactors cancelled might instead host large operating nuclear stations, along with the jobs and economic boosts that come with them. The cultural memory of 3 Mile Island as a scare doesn't exist, so younger generations don't have that reference of nuclear accident in America in mind. Until Fukushima in 2011, Americans in this alternate timeline consider nuclear accidents a foreign problem at worst. The term China syndrome isn't part of the popular vocabulary of fear. Pop culture might reflect a more positive or neutral view of nuclear energy. Perhaps there are fewer movies and TV shows depicting nuclear power as inherently dangerous, from fiction like The Simpsons' satirical Springfield reactor, which itself might have been inspired by TMI's notoriety in our timeline. Technologically, a sustained nuclear build-out could spur more innovation in reactor design. With robust public and financial support, the industry might invest in next-generation reactors earlier, designs with even better safety features or new fuel cycles. By the 2000s, the US could be testing advanced reactors, like passively safe models or high-temperature reactors, with less political resistance. The urgency to solve nuclear waste disposal would also intensify. In our timeline, the lack of new reactors and public opposition stalled efforts to open a long-term waste repository, such as Yucca Mountain. In the alternate timeline, with spent fuel accumulating from a larger reactor fleet, the federal government faces pressure to act. Perhaps by the 1990s, Yucca Mountain, or an alternative site, is successfully opened to store nuclear waste, a project that in reality has languished. The greater acceptance of nuclear technology might even trickle into other domains. Maybe the public is more open to nuclear-powered vessels or research reactors, given the industry's solid track record at home. It's worth noting that economics would still play a role. Some of those 1970s reactor orders were cancelled, not just due to fear, but also due to high costs and lower than projected electricity demand. In the alternate scenario, nuclear power would still face competition from other sources. If the 1980s saw a glut of reactors built, by the 1990s electricity prices might drop from the abundance of supply, potentially straining utility finances. Yet, nuclear plants, once built, produce power relatively cheaply. The US might benefit from more stable electricity prices in the long run, with less volatility from fossil fuel markets. Regions that were coal-dependent could see a transition to nuclear-generated electricity, altering the economic landscape for coal mining areas. Perhaps the decline of coal comes earlier or more sharply, shifting jobs and political emphasis away from coal states sooner. As the 21st century progresses, America stands as a far more nuclear-powered nation. By the 2020s, when climate change dominates the global agenda, the US finds itself emitting significantly less carbon from power generation than it did in our reality, all because one pivotal accident in 1979 never scared the country off the nuclear path. Internationally, US leadership in nuclear technology remains strong. American firms export reactors worldwide, competing successfully with French, Russian, and later Chinese companies, because they never suffered the loss of credibility that 3 Mile Island caused. The world's energy map might look different. Perhaps more countries, especially developing ones, would have adopted nuclear power in the 1980s and 1990s, seeing the US example, potentially reducing global reliance on oil and coal. Yet this vision must be tempered with an important question. Does avoiding 3 Mile Island truly lead to a better outcome, or just different risks? Without that disaster, the momentum of nuclear buildup could lead to complacency and an eventual reckoning. Imagine if an American nuclear plant had a serious accident in, say, 1995, after years of unchecked expansion. That might result in an even larger tragedy if safety weaknesses were never addressed. Alternatively, perhaps the industry's inherent culture of safety, even without TMI's reforms, would have been enough to prevent any major accidents. After all, no further major accidents occurred in the US after 3 Mile Island, a testament to improved practices. It's possible that here, US nuclear operations remain incident-free through the decades, preserving public trust permanently. The industry could argue that 3 Mile Island was never needed to prove their safety. They would have managed it on their own. In this thought experiment, we see how one avoided disaster changes many threads of historical progress. A United States unshaken by 3 Mile Island is a nation that doubles down on nuclear energy, gaining cleaner power and energy independence, but taking on the long-term responsibilities that come with it. Would this America be better off? In terms of carbon emissions and perhaps energy security, quite possibly, yes. We might have entered the climate fight with a stronger hand. But the shadow side is harder to measure. Public trust is a delicate thing. And in our timeline, it was the shock of 1979 that led to greater transparency and strict oversight of nuclear plants. Without the disaster, the social license for nuclear energy is stronger, yet it was earned without crisis, perhaps a testament to good engineering, or perhaps a precarious faith untested by fire. By avoiding 3 Mile Island, the US chooses a different path into the late 20th century, one where the atomic age never lost steam. From the power grid to geopolitics to environmental health, the effects would be profound. As with all alternate history scenarios, there are trade-offs every step of the way. Would we trade the cautionary lesson of 3 Mile Island for a chance at greater nuclear benefits? What do you think? This exploration shows how close we came to a very different energy future. One incident, or the lack of it, can send history down a new trajectory. The story of 3 Mile Island teaches us both about the dangers of technology and the dangers of fear. In our alternate timeline, we avoided the fear and perhaps unlocked opportunities while courting different dangers. It's a fascinating balance to consider. The legacy of a world without the 3 Mile Island accident is mixed. A stronger nuclear industry powering the nation, potentially mitigating climate change and altering economics, but one that might face its moment of truth at a later date. History often hinges on pivotal moments like that early spring day in 1979. By imagining if things had gone differently, we gain insight into just how influential that event really was. If you enjoyed this journey through an alternate history, please hit the like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. How do you imagine the world would look today if the 3 Mile Island disaster had never occurred? Do you envision a nuclear renaissance or foresee other challenges emerging? We'd love to hear your ideas. And don't forget to subscribe to the Alternate History channel for more thought-provoking explorations of the past that never was. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious about history.